Hello everyone, it's time for the extra advance. Today's topic is skill checks. I'm going to start with an example that models a fairly ideal path for skill checks and introduces some key ideas. Next, I will break down the details to illustrate how to enhance this approach. Then I will share the key to skill checks. Hello everyone, my name is Atchax and let's get started. Skill checks were derived from the concept of cheese as it exists in Starcraft. Cheese is typically an early, extremely committed attack. Basically, if the cheese works, you win. If it doesn't work, you lose. When I was silver in StarCraft, I lost a lot to cheeses. I just could not figure them out. At some point, I decided that cheeses were unbalanced and nobody should ever use them, which, believe it or not, did not help at all in beating them. As I got better, I started scouting, and once I did, I was able to see cheeses coming in advance, and I could counter them. From that one switch, I started winning something like 90% of anti-cheeses. This fresh perspective led me to the conclusion that cheeses are not unbalanced. They are a test to see whether the opponent scouted. In the rank that I was in at the time, about 90% of players did not scout, meaning about that percentage of opponents in my rank would fail the test. I started using two cheeses, Proxy 2 Racks Reaper and 5 Racks Marines, and I did these almost every game. I ended up winning about 90% of my cheesing games. That also meant I lost 10% of games to players who did scout and know how to counter my cheeses. But I was happy to accept this win ratio, and I shot up the ladder pretty quickly. Cheeses carried me up to about plat, at which point the ratio dropped sharply, and I had to learn what I had previously called the real game better in order to bring myself to diamond. One of the most important factors is how the opponents view skill checks. There are a large category of players who view many skill checks as being either unbalanced or unfair, and oftentimes these players do not adapt. And therefore it is possible to run up the score with the same checks over and over. This view is understandable because it is often the placeholder before a player learns how to beat various skill checks. The next category is players who are either naturally optimistic or know they can adapt, but do not already know the specific counter. These players will tend to come up with an adaptation or a workaround fairly quickly, but you can often trade at least 2 or 3 for 1 as long as you can adapt to their adaptation or you can switch it up once they figure you out. It's a situation you can often be very happy with. Then there are the players who already know the counter and will brutally shut you down. If you catch them off guard, you can still trade 1 for 1, but definitely avoid using the skill check on them again. There is some mix of these players at every rank to my knowledge, but the amount that are in each category depends on the skill check and the rank, and that ties into the next idea. That moment where I flipped from losing to most cheeses to crushing most cheeses, that moment is extremely important, because up until that point, it was very difficult to counter cheeses. Then the tables turned and it was easy to beat them. Skill checks are designed with a difficulty imbalance in mind. The skills to pass the skill check should usually be more difficult than performing the skill check itself. And so ideally you want to hit the sweet spot where you can easily perform a skill check that opponents cannot easily counter. That moment where the tables turn is extremely important because a certain percentage of players in your rank in Valorant will not have had that moment yet, whether that's with a specific skill check or with skill checks as a whole. That percentage is going to very closely relate to your success rate with a skill check in-game. Another of the most important factors is how you view skill checks, which is why this video is important. It's crucial to understand that skill checks are incredibly fragile. The actual distance between being destroyed by a skill check and destroying a skill check is very, very small. It is the mentalities of opponents and the drilling of habits that prevent them from moving that distance. Skill checks are a very powerful glass cannon. When they break, they can shatter into a million pieces. That 10% of games that I lost when cheesing, those were typically absolutely brutal shutdowns. Accepting these losses beforehand is important in order to avoid being frustrated. And there is definitely no reason to be frustrated because these generally reflect the nature of skill checks rather than you. Why would a player be willing to accept such a bad outcome on occasion? The answer is the key to skill checks, the win-loss ratio, and the key to that is the rank. Most players cannot achieve anywhere near an outrageous win rate like 90% in the deserved rank with conventional skill, because the ranking system naturally tries to find a point where you trade wins and losses fairly evenly. Any improvement may increase skill, but when factored into the overall player with a myriad of strengths, weaknesses, and skills, it may not have much of an impact. Skill checks are special because they can carry a player towards a point where that skill check is countered or not countered fairly evenly. In many cases, that point is much higher up in the rankings than the distance a player's current skill is above the rank average. In addition, skill checks have a way of cutting out a lot of the complicated strengths and weaknesses and distilling the win conditions down close to the check. As a result, skill checks can net a much higher win percentage. That win percentage is what allows players to absolutely climb. When I started out in CSGO, I avoided using the P90 because I was afraid of being trapped as a P90 player without any other skills. Is a similar fear reasonable in Valorant with skill checks? Well, in the case of higher ranks, it's difficult to have skill checks as the foundation of gameplay. By this point, players probably already have a strong base of skills. Skill checks become these highly effective and easy supporting elements of gameplay for highly targeted use against specific opponents. For Iron and Bronze, it actually is possible to effectively build gameplay around skill checks. As I mentioned at the end of my story, the ratio of wins will drop as you climb, since more players at higher ranks will pass skill checks. This means you need to transition out of skill checks and into increasing more conventional skill at some point if you want to keep moving up. So if you have to increase your skill at some point, why even bother learning skill checks in the first place? First of all, you can rank up much more quickly this way. We've already gone over this in depth, but there aren't many players who can win such a high percentage of their matches on conventional skill relative to their rank. On top of that, learning skill checks will help you find your own bad habits. You will see how easy it is to destroy players for certain behaviors that you may not have noticed if you weren't looking. Further, you can see how players beat your skill checks so that you can beat other players who try to use those checks on you. Finally, we arrive at possibly the most important reason, the nature of Iron and Bronze. Multiple factors make it super easy to get stuck here, even for players whose conventional skills are above average for their rank. You don't always have the best teammates to model your play off of. And higher ranked players still have severe weaknesses, but the weaknesses typically don't overlap as much, so it's easier to find your own and learn how to improve them. The volume of mistakes makes it so that players can strike out at random and likely exploit some mistake they may not have even seen. This fuels an environment that is very random and chaotic and volatile, and that environment can stifle growth. Many players can improve a lot more and more quickly in an environment where that loop is broken, and where their mistakes aren't being reflected back at them. That was certainly true for me in Starcraft. Being at a level where certain skills like scouting, build orders, and macroing in between micro were common helped me learn these skills more quickly, both by reviewing game footage and by being held to a higher standard. That was also true for me in CSGO. I was in the lowest ranked tier in CSGO for a long time. I've been through this cycle multiple times, which is why I'm familiar with how it goes and why I adopted this method to break it. Skill checks are a way to channel that chaos that is working against you and use it to glide your way up to a rank that can allow you to grow better. My name is Atchax. I hope you found some value in this video. Don't forget to subscribe. Best of luck and have a great day.